Russia on high alert as S-400 elite US and Canadian troops mass at Poland's border with Belarus and Kaliningrad, a deployment that has instantly triggered alarm bells in Moscow and raised fears of direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, because this sudden surge of combat-ready soldiers is not an ordinary exercise but a full-fledged demonstration of power positioned at one of the most volatile fault lines in Europe. And the Kremlin has already declared that this mobilization is a dangerous provocation that could destabilize the entire region, with Russian officials warning that any misstep could lead to uncontrollable escalation, which is why military movements, satellite surveillance, and intelligence warnings are intensifying hour by hour as both sides prepare for a standoff unprecedented since the Cold War. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Please subscribe and like my videos, because today we are breaking down one of the most dangerous and explosive developments yet in the NATO-Russia crisis, the arrival of 300 American and Canadian elite soldiers in Poland, just miles away from Russian territory, an event that military strategists believe could mark the beginning of a new phase in this conflict. The troops have been deployed under NATO's Eastern Security umbrella, but analysts point out that their numbers, composition, and location all point towards a far more serious purpose than routine training, since these units include airborne divisions, armored brigades, long-range artillery, advanced drone operators, and special forces teams, all of which are specifically designed for rapid strike missions, defensive reinforcement, or potential intervention inside Ukraine if NATO makes that decision. And from Russia's perspective, the buildup cannot be interpreted as anything less than preparation for direct involvement. The Kremlin's military command has immediately responded by placing its Western military district on maximum readiness, deploying additional S-400 and S-500 anti-aircraft batteries into Kaliningrad, mobilizing Iskander tactical missile systems, and conducting live fire drills across Belarusian territory in coordination with Allied forces stationed there, making it clear that Russia is not only aware of the NATO buildup but ready to counter it with force if necessary, and this has created a high-stakes environment where both sides are shadowing each other's every move, with intelligent aircraft circling overhead, naval forces patrolling the Baltic Sea, and cyber defense units bracing for digital warfare. For Moscow, the appearance of 300 NATO soldiers is seen as proof that Washington and Ottawa are escalating the war to pressure Russia into concessions it would otherwise never accept, while for NATO leaders, this deployment is marketed as a defensive shield, a deterrent against any Russian attempt to expand its operations beyond Ukraine, especially into Poland or the Baltic states. But regardless of rhetoric, the reality is that both sides are now locked in a dangerous dance of power where the line between deterrence and provocation is razor thin. From the American perspective, Pentagon officials have described the operation code, named Iron Resolve, as a critical step to reassure allies on the eastern flank, pointing out that Poland in particular has demanded stronger NATO protection since the start of Russia's war in Ukraine. But critics in Washington warn that stationing elite combat-ready forces so close to Russian borders could backfire by giving Moscow a justification to escalate. And within hours of the announcement, Russian media was already framing the deployment as proof that NATO is preparing for war. Canada's involvement has also surprised many observers, since this is the largest Canadian troop presence in Eastern Europe in decades, involving hundreds of special forces operators, armored units with Leopard 2A7 tanks, and drone reconnaissance teams. And while Ottawa insists this is a show of solidarity with allies, Russian analysts argue that even Canada's relatively smaller contribution adds symbolic weight, because it shows that NATO's unity is not limited to the United States and Europe, but extends across the Atlantic, making this a truly global confrontation. The number 300 is not random, because this force is large enough to conduct independent operations for weeks, supported by its own logistics and engineering units, fuel depots, medical facilities, and mobile communication hubs, meaning this is not a symbolic gesture but a fully operational Combat grouping ready for battlefield deployment at a moment's notice, and experts stress that this is exactly what alarms Russia the most, since unlike symbolic rotations of a few hundred soldiers, this force has the structure and scale of a strike-ready army. Positioned strategically near the Suwalki Gap, the narrow stretch of land connecting Poland to Lithuania and bordering Belarus and Kaliningrad, the deployment directly covers NATO's most vulnerable choke point, a corridor that military strategists warn could be Russia's first target in a large war, because if Moscow ever managed to cut off this gap, it would isolate the Baltic states from the rest of NATO, creating an instant strategic crisis, which is why NATO has chosen to mass troops there, and why Russia now sees this as a direct preparation for future conflict. In Moscow, politicians, generals, and state TV anchors have reacted furiously, calling this NATO move the final step toward open war. And officials from the Russian Security Council have even hinted that tactical nuclear missiles could be redeployed in response, specifically into Kaliningrad and Belarus, which would put nearly all of Poland and much of Central Europe under immediate nuclear threat. Satellite imagery has already confirmed that Russian Iskander missile systems and mobile artillery columns have been moving into Belarusian territory over the past 48 hours, and Belarusian state media has reported joint Russian-Belarusian exercises designed to counter NATO aggression, making it clear that Moscow is not treating this as a temporary drill, but as the opening phase of a potential standoff. Poland itself has welcomed the NATO deployment enthusiastically, with Prime Minister Donald Tusk stating that Poland will never stand alone against Russian aggression, and describing the arrival of American and Canadian troops as proof that NATO's Article 5 commitment is real. But critics within Poland are increasingly worried that being turned into NATO's frontline fortress makes the country a primary target for Russian retaliation, since in any open conflict, Poland would be the first battlefield, absorbing missile strikes, cyber attacks, and sabotage operations. Polish citizens, while broadly supportive of NATO, are expressing fear about the growing presence of foreign troops, because while they provide security, they also make Poland the central stage of confrontation, a reality that many fear will bring destruction if the crisis escalates further. European leaders are divided in their reactions, with Baltic states like Lithuania and Estonia celebrating the deployment as overdue reinforcement against Russia's aggression, while leaders in Germany and France call for de-escalation, warning that Europe is now on the edge of a catastrophic war, and urging both NATO and Russia to open new communication channels before it is too late. Yet behind the diplomatic language, the reality is that Europe has not faced such a direct buildup of rival forces since the Cold War, and unlike that era, today's situation involves an active war in Ukraine that already consumes vast resources and creates constant risks of spillover. Ordinary people across Europe are watching the crisis unfold with deep anxiety, because for them the deployment of thousands of troops is not just a strategic maneuver. It is a reminder that their lives could change overnight if war erupts, and this fear is compounded by the fact that nuclear weapons are openly discussed by both sides as part of deterrence, making the situation far more volatile than many would like to admit. For Russia, the fear is encirclement and regime survival. For NATO, the fear is that weakness will invite further aggression, and in this clash of insecurities, the presence of 300 elite soldiers becomes more than just numbers on a map. It becomes a potential trigger for a global confrontation. As the standoff continues, analysts warn that both sides are entering a phase where miscalculation is almost inevitable, because the closer rival armies position themselves to one another, the greater the chance that a minor incident, an accidental border clash, a drone shot down, a misfired missile, could spiral out of control, dragging the world into a war that neither side may have originally intended. And so the question remains, is this deployment a shield to prevent war, or a sword that makes war more likely? The answer will shape not only the fate of Ukraine but the entire future of Europe, and as Russia stays on high alert, NATO builds its steel wall, and Poland becomes the fortress in between. The world watches nervously, hoping that deterrence holds, but fearing that history is about to repeat itself in the most catastrophic way.